Welcome to a quick discussion of Spider-Man 2. Ahead of Insomniac's next game, I wanted to revisit the very first attempt at an open-world Spider-Man game. When this game was released in 2004, it was actually a really big deal for a few reasons. For one thing, at this time especially, licensed games and movie games in particular tended to have a fairly negative stigma surrounding them as being very glitchy or overall rushed. Spider-Man 2 actually reviewed really well at the time. The console versions averaged to about an 80 out of 100 from critics, which is really good for a movie tie-in of this era. There are also several other versions as well. The PC version, for example, is an entirely different game, and from what I've heard, is not very good. There are also several handheld versions for the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and PSP, and I'm pretty sure all of those are different games as well from each other. In general, the console version of Spider-Man 2 is also really important because, in addition to being the first open-world Spider-Man game, it's also the first open-world superhero game in general. For the most part, I think it's actually a very valiant attempt at an open-world superhero game of this era, but it definitely is showing its age nowadays. One thing I've noticed from playing the game again is it kind of has pacing issues. Basically, you can occasionally run into random crimes, like this, but a lot of the crimes are actually given out by people, indicated by the green icons. Basically, you have to talk to people to give you quests, and this kind of breaks up the pacing of the game, and especially because certain chapters have point requirements, you basically have to go through a lot of these missions, and it can be very tedious having to sit through cutscenes every time you want to initiate a random event. Let's find one person to talk to over here and initiate an event for the sake of demonstration, but again, this can get old very quickly because this does break up the pacing of everything. Basically, certain chapters have story missions and other requirements as well, for example, gaining a certain amount of points from completing missions or unlocking certain upgrades from a shop. So basically, if you don't get enough points within the actual story mission, you do have to farm a little bit from these different side missions. There are other side activities as well, including challenge races, where basically you have to go through certain spots of certain areas in a time limit, and in some cases you actually have to perform specific actions. So for example, sometimes there'll be a checkpoint on a wall, and you specifically have to wall run through it for it to actually count. So it is a nice way to change up the overall gameplay from just stopping crimes, but in general, it can also get somewhat tedious. There are also other mission types as well, including basically taking photos for the Daily Bugle by going to specific parts of the world in a specific time limit, and obviously, most notably, there are the pizza missions, where you have to deliver pizzas and avoid flipping in midair to avoid messing up the pizzas. Obviously, that mode is most popular because of its iconic music. This is actually one of the tougher mission types. Basically, towards the end of the game, you have these characters in mechs, and these can actually be really annoying to take down. But luckily, you actually have a slow-mo mode using Spider-Man's spider senses, activated using the D-pad. You can also lock on with down on the D-pad if I'm not mistaken, and basically this gives you a larger window to actually dodge attacks, and in some cases counter-attacks. Spider-Man himself also has slightly different combos when using the Spider Sense mode as well, but it is tied to the blue gauge on the main HUD. So basically it'll have to charge back up, so you can't use it all the time. You do have Spider Senses at all time. You might notice the flasher on Spider-Man's head whenever an enemy is about to attack. So it is kind of also interesting to note how much this game influenced other superhero games in more ways than just the open world design, but also a little bit of the combat. And similar to other games like even the Insomniac Spider-Man games, you also have the ability to actually change targets mid-combo using the control stick. So again, it's fascinating how much of the DNA of other superhero games going forward can be traced back to this game in particular. It really was foundational for superhero games going forward. In general, I still think this game is a lot of fun, but in a lot of ways, it's actually surprising how much certain aspects have aged well, even in comparison to more modern outings with this character. For example, the web swinging is still considered really good in this game, and in some ways, people still actually think it has some benefits over more modern implementations, even including the first two Insomniac games. For example, there's actually less restrictions to web swinging, so for example, we'll demonstrate after we get through this fight, but in the Insomniac games, for example, you'll automatically let go of the web at a certain point, while in this game, you can actually keep holding onto the web as long as you want, which is actually really nice. It gives you a lot more control, but it makes it a lot more difficult, so I understand why for the more modern games, it's a little bit more streamlined, even though again, it is a little bit less freeform as a result. We also have one of the most infamous mission types here of retrieving a lost balloon for a child. Luckily, the balloon didn't fly too far away there. Yeah, you have various side activities of varying quality, basically, and as a result, I do feel like the open world is really fun to swing around in, but the actual, mission types aren't necessarily outstanding for the most part. I definitely feel like later Spider-Man games had more interesting mission variety, but again, for the first attempt, it's pretty solid nonetheless. It's also worth mentioning that the studio Treyarch also worked on the first movie game, which is also a very different gameplay style. It's actually a lot more level-based, but there are several outdoor missions that take place across skyscrapers, and this is also based off of the PS1 Spider-Man games as well, where basically the webs will stick to the sky, and it's very automated. So this is actually the first game in a 3D space where the webs actually stick to buildings, and you have to actually be aware of having something for the web to attach to, which also adds a layer of strategy that previously was unseen with these games. Going forward, a lot of the later Spider-Man games had worse implementations of web swinging, oddly enough. For example, Ultimate Spider-Man, based on the comic series of the same name, and also developed by Treyarch, actually feels a lot more stiff in my opinion. In some ways, I almost feel like it makes sense given that the Ultimate storyline features a much younger, high school-aged Peter Parker, so maybe the web swinging being a little bit less dynamic almost makes sense for the character being less experienced as Spider-Man. But in general, it does feel a lot more stiff, and as a result, less fluid, and enjoyable to just kind of swing around the city. And then afterwards, there was the Spider-Man 3 movie tie-in, which is not a very good game by comparison. The main issue with that game is its camera, in my opinion. Basically, the camera in this game stays relatively, static while you're swinging around. In Spider-Man 3, it feels like the camera is constantly, moving around to the point where it's actually very disorienting. But again, I feel like this camera is surprisingly good at following Spider-Man without actually being disorienting. After that, there was Spider-Man Web of Shadows for the PS3 and 360 specifically, and Wii actually, because the Wii got the same version, though downscaled. But the PS2 and PSP got the same version, and then the DS got got a separate version from that. And Web of Shadows is an interesting game. It also has a really good web swinging system in place with a lot of momentum-based gameplay. It's just a shame that the rest of the game isn't particularly outstanding, kind of like a couple of other Spider-Man games and open-world games in general. There's the problem of having really good traversal systems and also having really good combat systems, and a lot of games don't really stick the landing on one or the other. For example, I feel like the Amazing Spider-Man movie games actually had a pretty solid combat system, albeit it just copies the Arkham games. But the web swinging in the first Amazing Spider-Man game is back to the Spider-Man PS1 style, where the webs actually don't attach to buildings, and it's very automated. Meanwhile, Spider-Man 2, or The Amazing Spider-Man 2, actually goes to a different system where basically the left and right triggers actually control the web swing, and you have to alternate like you're basically firing webs from each hand. From what I gather, that web swinging system was actually not disliked, but just the game surrounding it was also very poor because of the mission structure of it. But again, I've actually never played a lot of these games. I've never played The Amazing Spider-Man 2, And for example, there were a couple of other games that went back to a level style, which were Edge of Time and Shattered Dimensions. Shattered Dimensions is also a big deal because it kind of established the concept of a Spider-Verse, but the web swinging is more static, like the first movie game and the PS1 game. Shattered Dimensions is still a really fun game in its own right, though. It just doesn't quite have the open-ended structure of something like this, so it's a very different style of game. I've heard Edge of Time is kind of not as good, so I never actually played it. But in general, I feel like Spider-Man works really well in an open-world setting. Obviously, there are some indoor missions as well, but the majority of the game, and a lot of Spider-Man games going forward, do take place in the open world itself. I also like how a lot of Spider-Man's web powers have actually been integrated into gameplay. For example, being able to like use webs to disarm or stun enemies is really cool, and there's just a lot of cool features in this game that really tap into a lot of aspects of the character, which I really like. Again, despite being a movie tie-in, it's surprisingly ambitious, and again, a lot of movie tie-ins at this time didn't stick super closely to the movie plot, and that's the case here as well. For example, you have a lot of other villains too. For example, obviously Doc Ock is the only one in the movie, but you have other characters showing up throughout, like Mysterio, Shocker, and Black Cat also. And they have various missions that kind of interweave into the story. The story itself is very loosely based on Spider-Man 2, like you obviously can't have Peter losing his powers, because what would you do for gameplay? But the overall idea of Peter being basically struggling to maintain his, like, life as Peter Parker and Spider-Man, that's still intact to some extent. But again, a lot of the nuance of the story is missing for the sake of gameplay. There are a couple actors from the movie, and in general, the voice acting in this game isn't particularly outstanding. A lot of it feels fairly phoned in, to be honest. It's almost memorable because of how deadpan some of the deliveries are, though, so there's that benefit of having a couple of the movie actors in this game. But yeah, the main appeal of this game is really the web swinging and just the overall sense of freedom. There's also another web swinging mode, which is actually something that I really don't see in many Spider-Man games, where basically you don't automatically let go, so you can actually like chain webs together like this. I usually don't use this mode just because I'm not really used to it anymore after all the other Spider-Man games since that have basically the easy swing mode of this game as more of the default. But again, it's nice to have a more complicated option, and despite having a much higher skill ceiling, I almost feel like if you actually get used to the web swing in this game, it's actually extremely rewarding. And again, in a way that even like the first two Insomniac games don't quite reach, because I almost feel like those games aren't as affected by momentum. But for the sake of the meme, we have to show off a pizza mission over here.
I got a bunch of pizzas to deliver, and you're late. Always, you are late. Well, now you have to hurry. Get going.
You got it, Mr. Aziz. I'll deliver those pizzas before you know it. I'll start there.
This is the first mission of this type, so it shouldn't be too bad. We have one pizza to deliver, but basically we can't flip around too much or else the pizza will get jostled and ruined. But yeah, basically you have these little time missions like this that are a nice change of pace as well. So again, there's a lot of variety. It's just, I almost feel like it's still fairly basic and definitely feels like an early open world game.
You did good, Parker. Everyone got their pizzas. Good job. Keep it up, and there will always be work for you.
I'm glad you're happy, Mr. Aziz. Thanks.
But in general, I do feel like one of my biggest complaints is just how, yeah, inorganic a lot of these side quests end up feeling, because you have to actually go out of your way to activate side quests in most cases. I wish more had, like, more like the random crimes that happen, or random events, like, you know, the random, like, muggings and trying to retrieve lost balloons and things like that just sort of happen as you're swinging around instead of having to like initiate a sequence basically and like sit through cutscenes. So again, it definitely feels a little bit dated in that regard. Later open world games definitely figured out a better flow for this, and again, I almost feel like the pacing gets disrupted a lot by needing to meet certain point requirements between story missions. But in general, again, this game has aged surprisingly well. And again, revisiting it for the first time in a long time, it still holds up pretty okay. I remember playing this game not too long after launch, because I remember really liking the movie, actually. And I remember having a really good time with it, except for me getting stuck on a lot of levels in this game, because this game was surprisingly difficult. Though, to be fair, it was a T-rated game, and I was like probably like 10 or 11 at the time, so I guess it makes sense. I might not have been the best at games of this caliber, but in general, nowadays the game is a lot more straightforward. I look back at a lot of levels and kind of think, why did I have trouble with this? But again, that's just a case of, you know, being older and better at video games in general. But yeah, it is sort of remarkable how good this was. A lot of times when a series tries to branch into a new genre entirely, it doesn't necessarily go very well. But yeah, this is actually a rare case of a very successful first attempt right away, and the subsequent attempts actually not being as good in a lot of cases. Again, I actually still stand by Ultimate Spider-Man being a pretty alright game, though again, it's a lot more stiff, I'd say, in terms of the traversal. But you also have the benefit of like being able to play as Venom along with Spider-Man, and I almost feel like the combat system also takes the like directional combat even farther, and almost does end up feeling like a prototype of like something you'd see in the Arkham games or the Insomniac games as well. But again, like the Spider-Man 3 movie game also had the problem of the web swinging being very disorienting, but also another problem of following trends with games like God of War and Resident Evil 4. So there's tons of QuickTime events. The one benefit of the QuickTime events in Spider-Man 3 is you have a lot of very infamous cutscenes of failed QuickTime events, and the amount of effort they've gone to animate the fail states of these cutscenes is like the best part of Spider-Man 3, because the game itself is fairly average to bad at parts. And yeah, Web of Shadows, I just feel like the core gameplay loop is really tedious, even though the web swing, once again, is actually pretty good. I also feel like the choice making is way too binary, and ends up not feeling very fluid, if that makes sense, because it's so rigid and having a good choice and a bad choice with not a lot of nuance in between. And yeah, I remember Shadow Dimensions, despite not being open world, still being really good. But obviously, the Insomniac games, even as someone who also really likes the Ratchet & Clank series, so I'm not biased at all, clearly. I do think, overall, the Insomniac games are my favorite Spider-Man games. They're just the best, well-rounded Spider-Man experiences, in my opinion, in terms of, like, story, gameplay, not only for, like, traversal, but also combat, and just, like, level design, and just overall, those games are pretty solid. I'm still really excited for Spider-Man 2. I'm kind of not as excited as for the previous two, just because this is the third one we're getting in a relatively short amount of time, in about 5 years or so. So again, I'm still looking forward to Spider-Man 2 at some point, but I'm not, like, as excited. But yeah, knowing that it's, like, Insomniac and everything, I'm sure the game will turn out well. But again, it's also coming out in a very crowded release cycle, so I have other games I'm prioritizing around the time anyway, but again, I am hoping that the game ends up being really good, and I do look forward to playing it eventually. But yeah, that was a quick look at Spider-Man 2. Again, this game definitely feels a little bit dated at times in terms of just how old it is. It's almost 20 years old, but for that, it's actually surprisingly important to the overall genre, and yeah, it does actually hold up surprisingly okay, all things considered. But with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.